Greetings. Yes, as the title states of this video, we will be doing a few comparisons between the 83 to 85 VT750 and VT700 side by side with the VT700 and VT750 of 86 and 1987. There's a lot of differences. You can see the silver one, that's going to be our 86, 87, and these black ones are all going to be 83 to 85. Now, a little bit of background information before we dive too deep into these. Like I said, these black ones are all going to be 83 to 85. The bikes as a whole didn't really change throughout that time period. And then the only thing that changed with the engines was the bore. In 1983, they were all 750s. In 84 started the famous quote-unquote Harley tariff. So there was an import on all, or there was a tariff on all imported motorcycles that were over 700 cc's, or 750 and larger, you could say. Details aren't too important. So in 1984, Honda turned most of their 750s into 700s. With the V4s, they de-stroked them. With these guys, they de-bored them. So what was 750 cc's had the bore size shrunk a little bit, turned these into 700s. So they use a different piston, different cylinder, and that's kind of all there is for differences between these. They're otherwise largely the same. There's no notable differences between the 700 and 750 version of the black engine. The silver engine is where we start seeing loads of differences here. So the main thing being it's mostly silver now. The case covers and the valve covers, because the head bolts go down through them, or head nuts. Anyhow, yeah, most of the pieces are either clear-coated aluminum or chrome, like these coolant tubes, or they're just painted cylinder, like the heads and cylinders themselves. Yes. So they're mostly silver and a little bit of chrome. Whereas these guys just have this pattern. They have striped fins on the head. They have silver valve covers, silver rounds on the case covers. Starter should be black, someone changed that. And then the whole rest of it is black, including the two coolant pipes. Now the big difference between these is because the crankcases are the same between these. Crankshaft, transmission, all that is the same between these. Where things start getting different is the coolant passages. You can see on here, check out that water pump. It's way down in the corner, and it's only a single pipe that comes up around the slave cylinder for the clutch, and then it has a Y turning 1 into 2. Versus the black engine. We're coming right out of the water pump housing is 2 pipes, and those 2 remain separate, and then they go into the sides of the cylinder, wraps around the front, goes in through the side, whereas on this one, our 86 and 87 engine, it goes into the front and the rear of the cylinders. Much like the Honda Hawks, this engine, so much like that, they feed the coolant in through the sides of the backs or the fronts of the cylinders. But it's not just that; they would also change the valve covers. Again, you can see that these are a 3-piece design. There's a base, and it's got a tall section here, and then a narrow, shorter section here. And it's all one piece, but then these big pieces bolt on over it. This one goes over the cam sprocket, and then this one goes over the rockers and tappet adjusters. 86, they did away with the 3-piece design. They turned it into just a single piece valve cover. The whole thing just encases everything. So this one is a little less maintenance friendly. Not that you have to do much top-end maintenance to these, but you could check these out while the engine is in the bike assuming this engine is still in an 83 to 85 frame. The frames had changed a bunch. Before, the frame had two round tube rails that kind of went across the top here, and it left plenty of room for a snorkel to go down over the carbs, and that would be your intake plenum, as they say. So you remove that snorkel, and now you have full access to everything up through here between the two middle frame rails. For 86 and 87, they changed that, and they moved the intake into the frame. So that is the frame itself underneath the gas tank there. You can see those two ports. Those are what go to the two carburetors. So because there was no longer an access hole, I believe, Honda thought it was no longer needed to have a three-piece valve cover when you have to pull the engine out to do anything on the top end anyways. So that was the other big change. Also, towards the top, there was a change in coolant lines. I don't have one on it at the moment. I had to rob it for another project. But this is how the coolant pipes looked on the top of the black engines. You can see this pipe here just goes from the rear head under the carbs back over the front head. And then this goes into your thermostat housing. And then this here is just blanked off. They only have this extra little bit here so you can mount it here, making it rigid. But then next to this would be another elbow pipe just coming straight up from this head. It is actually the same exact piece as the 86 and 87s have on the front. But 86 and 87, they changed the rear pipe. They made it stick out in an angle because with the frame design they had, they couldn't quite fit all the coolant fittings in this front corner, and the carbs couldn't quite go around this guy all that great. So that's something we'll talk about in one of the next segments. This will be a 3-segment video, but before we get to the other two, we'll finish off on the engine internals themselves. But this is the main difference between the black engine and the silver engine. You can see the cooling fins, which are purely aesthetic, were enlarged on the silver engine, and they made it more round versus the prior one where it was kind of flat and square like that of the VT500s and the Magnas of the time, Sabres, all that jazz. Anyhow, if you see a striking difference, do say so. Well, there's two. One's more prominent than the other. First of all is this added pedestal. Honda had added this pedestal for concern of head gasket leaks in this area. You can see there obviously isn't one here. So there's absolutely nothing here. In my opinion, one wasn't really needed there. Where these engines blow head gaskets are right in here. Because you have all this heat that's not created by the cam chain at all. But there's nothing inside this area to dissipate the heat. Like over here we have cooling fins. Over here there's nothing. There's just some hot air and warm oil going up and down the cylinder. So this area is prone to have head gasket failures. This one is as well. So you can also see they had added a pedestal here to help cure that. So that's one more clamping force, but right where it was really needed. Also, the head gaskets are slightly different. You can see that on the silver engine, it is a single piece of metal. I think it's steel, but it could be aluminum for all I know, but I'm pretty sure it's steel. And then with this guy, it's typical fiber gasket that's a little bit thicker. Now the problem we have is you can't be using these head gaskets on these cylinders. If I remove the head gasket, you can kind of see what's going on. You can see on these silver engines, it's very unique to them. You can see they have these cutouts here for the two intake valves. So without those, the intake valves wouldn't really clear. When we set this older style head gasket on it, you can see it barely clears. and if you have an aftermarket head gasket, sometimes that won't clear. But otherwise all your holes line up. But with this pedestal here, you need to have a chunk of head gasket here to keep this guy from cracking, because that will happen if you don't have anything here. Surprisingly, you only put 15 foot-pounds of torque, it's either 15 or 17, on this bolt, and that alone is enough to split this with no gasket material here. And that kind of in lies the problem. Honda doesn't make the head gaskets for the silver engine anymore. As a matter of fact, no one makes the head gaskets for the silver engine anymore. However, the head gaskets for the PC800, so that's going to be the Pacific Coast 800, that supposedly has a backwards compatible head gasket for this. If you do the Honda part number search for that PC800 head gasket, it will say it will fit this. But for its compatibility, it's very hard to research the two. But anyhow, I haven't tried that yet. I'll put that part number in the description. But the problem is those aren't readily available from Honda either. All you can do for those is you can get them from, I believe, Athena, but they're only available over in the UK. So that kind of strikes the beginning of this video. The background information was all those head gasket issues. We don't have a good way of using head gaskets without valves either hitting the head gasket or the head gasket not contacting this one pedestal. This one's not a single problem, because when I overlay them, you can see there's still bolt access to that one. But this main pedestal here, that's a big concern. But these thicker head gaskets will make compression a little bit less. Yeah, so due to lack of parts availability, that's the route we're going with this earlier engine in the later frame. So that's what we got here is our 8687 VT750 or 700. So yes, we've been in the process of swapping over the black engine into that instead of the silver one it had in it. Like I said, there's just no differences around the block. One difference we have noticed is there's usually, I believe it's this bolt right here. The head of this bolt doesn't quite clear the 8687 frame. You look over at this one, the bolt is there, but I don't believe it sticks out as far. So we're kind of to the second part of the video now. How we get what to fit in the frame. You have to do a few modifications. The 700 engine that comes stock in this frame is a very snug fit. It really does not like going in or coming out. I think it hated coming out more than it did going in, or maybe vice versa. But it was a chore. First of all, because the cooling fins are so much bigger on the silver engine, makes getting around this frame section very difficult. Another problem is the shifter mechanism in the bottom of the engine. See that guy? For 83 to 85, the shifter mechanism was nowhere near these foot peg mounts. But for 86 and 87, they planted it right here. So there is a little nook, and that's where it sits. And it's tricky working around that, because when you lift up the engine, because they changed the frame, you don't have much vertical space above the top of the engine to be able to shift it up and down as you need to. So it's very difficult getting it in and out of here. So having the black engine will help with this. But what we had to do to make the black engine fit is, you can see this section of the frame has been dented a few times. We had to bend that in some. So what was now round on this top half is now just flat right here. And I did that solely so it would clear the water pump housing, or I should say the housing right above the water pump. we can better see it on this engine over here. So our frame rail comes right through here. And in stock form, the 86-87 frame will hit this part of the casting for the water pump. This guy, where the two pipes come out of. It clears everything down here fine, but it does hit this. So that's why we had to create a little bit of a dent in the frame, but it's not a problem. It's not structural. This part of the frame is structural, but what we did to it did not affect its structural ability. All we did was make a couple dents. We didn't crease anything. We didn't compromise anything. Right below it, from the factory, they had to put a big old crease in it just so it could clear the water pump they ended up using. Well, the other modification we had to do is we had to grind off a little bit of weld from this side stand. Again, it's nothing too structural. There's plenty of weld from here this way, but the weld had stuck out and it had gone all the way to here. We had to grind all that back so it would clear one of the bolts right below the output pinion. Again, it was one of them. So after we did those two modifications, the black engine fits in here no problem whatsoever. Oh, and I need to point out one last difference between these two engines was the exhaust. When they went with the 86-87 engine, you can see they made the exhaust just come out at a perfect 90-degree angle. And it's like that on both heads. Whereas 83 to 85, there was a little bit less or a little bit more than a 90-degree angle, depending on how you want to see it. But you can see that there is an angle there versus this one where it's just straight. So there was that change. But when you put the black engine in the silver engine frame, the black engine exhaust clears perfectly. And aside from that initial bend on the top here, these pipes are the same. In fact, you can even see that for 86 and 87, they had welded on this little upturn just for this exhaust. So the 83 to 85 pipes, they're identical to these guys. But this top mating surface is tilted a little bit more. And they don't have this extra section welded onto them. They end right about here, and then this is where you clamp them onto the rest of your exhaust, your mufflers and power chambers. All right, what we ended up doing for the coolant pipes, you can see there's obviously a difference for the rear coolant pipe, but the rear PCV, the crankcase vent, it's totally compatible, not going to be a single issue. But as far as the rear head's coolant pipe, because the front one is the same between these, for the rear, what we did was, or I should say what you can do is you can actually just use this one on your black engine to make it work in your silver engine bike. But what we did was we took two fronts, two black engine fronts, and I had cut off the bracket from one, and then I had re-brazed it, because that's all Honda does. They just brazed the two steel pieces with bronze. So I brazed it with solder, and it's more than firm. The tricky part, though, is going to be getting this guy to clear this bolt. On the silver engines, this bolt was relocated. I think it came out a little bit further. So for this bung to clear this bolt, I had it tilted closer to 90 degrees to the side than this one. This one's more like 30-ish. But this will work out fine because there's plenty of hose to go around as far as that part of the bike goes. That's not a single issue. But aside from that, this engine is now ready to go in. Or it is quote-unquote ready to go in, but we have to finish painting it. I just did the top-end rebuild on it, so now I have to clean it up, paint the whole thing, put on all of its new hoses. I have to tidy up the valve covers, and then it can go in and stay in, and this thing will rock. Because what we're also doing to this bike, and I don't know if I said it, but we're putting in the 750 instead of the 700. There's not much difference. Like I said towards the beginning of this video, the only difference is a little bit of bore, but the 750 will have a little bit more power. So it'll be happy trails for this bike. It will be quite nice. But utilizing the black engine also allows us to use more aftermarket exhausts. There's not too many aftermarket exhaust systems for the 86, 87, 700s and 750s, but there are loads for the 83 to 85. So yeah, we'll just be removing the stock system and replacing it with the 83, 85 aftermarket system. And the pipes are in about the same location, so they'll look fine. Now, before you say it, we actually did look into it. We had put the black engine in here, and that's when we found out we had to make those 2 clearances on the frame. Not a single problem there. Otherwise, all the other bolt holes lined up well, all the plumbing worked perfectly, even the carbs went in just like they did with the silver engine. But we hung up this subframe next, around the black engine like we should, and the brake pedal, and that still cleared the 83 to 85 exhaust. So we're in great shape, and the exhaust clears absolutely everything. You can take my word on it. I checked. I had to check everything I do because it's wrong not to. So you can take my word on it. You can go out and you can order up all these parts we're talking about, and what we say they fit, they will fit. You will not have any issues with them, besides the discrepancies for like those 2 spots on the frame we mentioned, these couple things on the cylinders we mentioned, and then the coolant pipes that we had mentioned, as well as the exhaust. But everything we talked about, I didn't miss anything, and I did not get anything wrong. So this is something you're welcome to do. But yeah, it'll look slick with this black engine in it. So everything else on this bike is, it's got a lot of chrome, and that's cool. But with the silver engine in there, it's a little much. But the engine will be slimmer, so it'll be more serviceable. The engine design itself is more serviceable on the black engines. There's more parts availability on the black engines. So there's a lot of upsides to it. The only downside to it is it won't be a numbers matching bike, and it won't be silver. But those are 2 things one could easily live with if they plan on keeping the bike for life. This is probably the final segment of the VT750 swap in a VT700 from the 86 to 87. So yeah, we got the black engine inside the silver engine bike. Yeah, it was that. And like I said earlier, a few clearance issues had to be fixed on the left side part of the frame. But otherwise, it's in. Everything clears well. You can see it yourself. The factory exhaust has the correct cutouts for the newer frame. And it clears all the foot controls beautifully. Even this odd rear brake rod setup. But one issue we had that we overcame with slip-on exhaust was these black engine head pipes. They fit the frame without any issues whatsoever, and they fit around all the foot controls. Not a single problem there. But they end right about here, and that's still well before the frame ends. So what you have to do is either get a chunk of pipe that has a gentle curve up, kind of similar to how the frame is, or you just put on a slip-on the end here. Because our 2 crossover pipes that we have a few crossover pipes. We have a few stock black engine power chambers. They do not work. They don't clear the frame, or they don't clear the center stand. And then these aftermarket Jardine crossovers, they don't clear the frame or the center stand. And then we have a Mac setup. So It's similar to this one, but this pipe right here is kind of funny. It goes straight to the rear head, and that doesn't clear the frame or center stand either. So for right now, slip-ons is kind of the only solution we found, which is fine. It leaves you with this ugly gap here. We have put in this prop bar just as a kind of mock-up, because we haven't settled on what kind of exhaust to have here, but just to have something. We do have some, oddly enough, Harley-Davidson slip-ons here in the place for right now. And then we'll decide if we want to remove these passenger foot pegs or not. Because by removing this, we could just have a simple bar that comes down along the body, meets up with this, and then this gap disappears. Otherwise, can get a section of pipe, like I said, that has a gentle bend upwards, make it so this pipe goes kind of up at a more aggressive angle instead of just being flat like this. But right now, it looks all right. We will move on to the other side here. So you can see that it still clears the chrome covers fine so far. Depending on what exhaust color you have, you might have issues. I put the exhaust color on this way because it made more sense, but I might have to spin it around. That may be backwards, possibly. But that's not too critical. You can spin that around. That's not an issue. But you can see the exhaust, it clears the left side foot pegs and foot controls perfectly fine. See that nice big old gap around all of that. On the side here, it wraps around the engine nice as it always did before. Fits underneath these two foot control standoffs. It's not touching any metal. And then again over here, it has the same issue. Right now we just have it propped up to where the stock hangers are, just for mock-up. And a little bit of runtime while we figure out what pipes to use. The only issue is with or I should say the only other issues with the exhaust is, you can see this kickstand clears fine. This has been slopped out terribly, and I've even done my old trick of pinching the clamp of the stand, and then putting a washer underneath the head of the bolt and then tightening it down, and normally it reduces play to hardly anything at all. But on this, part of the issue is the side stand is worn out inside that joint, and then the flat piece of steel that it pivots on, that's welded to the frame, that whole black part, that is like worn off really bad. So sometime we'll take the exhaust off, build that out with weld, grind it back down to how it should be, and then this guy will stop meandering. But right now, even as loose as it is, it'll never hit the pipes. So that's great, and it sticks far enough out. It should be like this, yeah, about like this, but even in its most relaxed or collapsed position, you can still fit your foot down here perfectly and grab that. But the issue we have is with the center stand. I don't know if someone had bent this. We've seen some of these Honda ones leave the factory bent, like the V65 Sabres. They look like they've been bent and manipulated by hand, and they actually do leave the factory that way. So I don't know if this is factory or not, but when we flip it up, it does hit the mufflers. So we'll have to come up with some sort of puck to put behind here. We've done that before. Otherwise, like I said, these mufflers only temporary. We will be changing these to something. If not, we are changing how these mount, and that might fix a few things. But this segment was primarily meant to address the clutch slave cylinder. So this is the clutch slave cylinder that you'll find on any of the black engines. You can identify it because it says ME9. That is Honda's code for the 83 to 85 750s and 700 Shadows. Now this is what the silver engines will have. This is the slave for the 86 to 87 Shadow 700s. They're almost perfectly interchangeable. They share the same exact bolt pattern. Problem is when I overlay them, you can see a few issues. On the silver engine one, that MK7, you can see it puts the banjo bolt further down, and it collides with this right here. And the initial thought as well, you just cut that off, remove it. So all it does is it just holds these two coolant tubes together. The problem is if you cut that off and remove it, these coolant tubes can move and twist, and then that's when you'll develop a leak, and that's no fun. But then also, the way the top of this pedestal is shaped, I was having issues with it colliding with the case, but I think that's something that's definitely easily addressed, because the pedestal is just wider on this. So you just simply grind that down some, and then it'll be fine. Like I said, the big issue is just these put the banjo bolt in a bad spot. So I do prefer the 83 to 85 one, and it's easy enough to put on. You just change them out, bleed out the clutch like you should, because the fluid in there goes bad over time, and when it goes bad you start losing clutch pressure, so you start losing clutch activation. But this line, you are able to bend it the X many inches towards the bottom. I think it's like the last 8 inches are malleable steel, so that's why I did. I had to finesse it around this coolant band clamp, because otherwise it would just contact it and it would stick out too far. So we have it the way it is now. I have to go into my stash of stuff, my stash of parts, and see if I have 83 to 85 plastic cover I can throw over this, because the silver cover will not work at all. Well, it obviously works on the stock engine, but it does not work once you've swapped the black engine into it. I'll show you why in a second. Alright, so I got it around and I'm holding it up here, our silver engine shaft cover next to our black engine. And you can see all the lines make sense. It all kind of looks right, but it mounts to the engine a little differently than the prior year. You have the 83 to 85 black plastic ones. These have a different bolt pattern on them. Then these, if we'll quick run over to our silver engine, and you can kind of see how they did this. So this is our silver engine. You can see they added a few embossments, one here, and then one here on the case even, for this guy to bolt up in all 3 of those locations. So we'll set this right here, and this is how it left the factory. But that's the problem we have, is the 3 bolt holes for this chrome guy are special to the silver engine only, and I'd have to do a lot of swapping just to use this guy when it doesn't quite look the best. And it looks real sweet on the silver engine, but on the black engine, that's stealthy, sexy black. It certainly looks out of place when we've made it so that there's not so much chrome. We've kind of subdued the dramatic chrome look. So we have that up against us. Otherwise, the plastic one will go in just like it did on the 83 to 85 bike that this black engine came out of. And it just mounts underneath, I believe, this screw or that one of those two. And I think one of these two also holds it down. But I have to go out and I have to find one and put it on. Otherwise, everything else fitted fine. Spark plug wires go around the valve covers just fine. Carbs are dimensionally the same, so they went in just as they always did. The airbox clears everything on the black engine. The radiator and lower coolant lines, all that worked out. I didn't have to change anything. The crankcase breather, right now I have it unhooked, but it does line up and fit that the same way it did on the silver engine. This is a carb vent tube. I'm deciding how I want to route that, and then doing the same thing with the PCV, just trying to figure out how I want it routed. And then the coolant tube, that was something I mentioned earlier. You do have to change the hard line for the coolant tube, so I did that. I showed how I did it. I pretty much cut the Honda one into two pieces and then brazed it like Honda did, but with the pipe at a different angle, and that worked out great. And then what I did for hose was the silver engine hose did not work. It wasn't quite long enough for the bends I made, because the bends I made I did specifically so it would clear this part of the valve cover that the PCV bung comes out of. But I also made it so that I could put a socket wrench down around the pipe and still torque that bolt down, because that was kind of the big deal. They changed a lot of stuff on this so that the coolant pipe wasn't really in the way of any torque specs, except for this guy. So you just put this one in first, do this one last. Now your pipe's solid, not in the way of anything. But because of the angle I had it at, and the slightly different height I had it at, I did have to change out the hose. And the hose I used was, funny enough, from an 86 Ford Escort. It was one of the heater core hoses. I got a bunch of them, and I always keep all my good radiator and coolant hoses. I just throw them in a box. So I was able to dig through it. I found one that was an L at the bottom, and then towards the top it had a serpentine thing. So I cut half of the serpentine thing off, and I made the L a little shorter, bobbed it off. So now it looks just like the one it had in it, but it fits good with our black engine. Otherwise, that's all we had to change mechanically for this to work. One thing we did have to do electronically, or as far as the electronics goes, we did have to change the pinout for the pickup coil connector. So if you've ever worked on these, underneath this part of the clutch cover are two pickup coils for the ignition. They're what control the spark timing, and it comes through this wire. This wire goes up in here. You see they're all whites, blues, and yellows. Two of these pins were flipped around in the 86 and the 87 700s, so I had to do that. I had to flip around two pins. All you have to do is just match up the colors like I did here. You can see I made it so blue touches blue, yellow touches yellow, and then I did white with blue touches white with blue, and white with yellow touches white with yellow, and then that's all done. Everything else you hook up like normal, not a single issue. And as you can see here, all of the mounting bolt holes line up perfectly. And yeah, that's all there is to it. It's a fairly simple swap. There's a few things you need to do that I had already mentioned and laid out for you guys, but yeah, it's actually quite easy with a little bit of know-how. It's something anyone could do themselves. You can see the engine totally clears the radiator fine, and the fan. That was a big concern, was, well, will the engine clear the fan? It certainly will. Same with these added coolant pipes that the silver engines don't have. You can see I even have the band clamps facing forward, and it still clears the fan by a bunch. I just can't get the camera in there to show it to you, but you can see there is an air gap there. It's bigger than it appears. Yeah, it worked like a charm. And there is a discernible power difference between the 750 black engine and the 700 silver engine. Going from that silver 700 to the black 750, it is a difference of 10 horsepower. That is discernible. Going from a black 700 to a 750, probably not worth your time. But going from the silver one to the black one, as far as reliability goes and parts availability goes, it's a big deal. And if you like the look of the black one more, this is the way to go. Now, the black engine is narrower, simply because the cooling fins on it don't stick out like they do on the silver engines. But these still look incredible from afar. On the left side, it looks great. It looks like Honda had made it that way. The right side, this just looks a little bare. When you grab your stock horn and put it up here, it all makes sense, and it all looks quite nice and presentable. So we're very happy with how that turned out, and we're excited if this helps others in the future, because this was a big deal. Better parts availability was the main reason here. But otherwise, performance-wise, it was a good upgrade. Very exciting. This probably will be the last segment, like I said, but otherwise, we'll have all these compiled together, and hopefully they'll help you some. So, happy riding.